Hello everyone. Today we're going to be focusing on learning a third language. At this point you probably know English, HTML. Well, let's go ahead and add CSS. Our main focus for today is going to be learning not only how to handle having all of these languages stuck in our head, but also just some tricks on how to manage everything all at once. Hope you'll join. So to get started, we're actually going to start a new CodePen project. We'll get back to the one we were working on previously, but for now, while we're learning the syntax of CSS, we're going to go ahead and start with a clean slate, but we'll actually use what we learn here to get back to our last project. So to begin, let's go ahead and actually review what the syntax of CSS is and how it's different from HTML. If you recall, in HTML, we have a syntax of an opening and closing tag that are encapsulated or put inside of a less than and greater than symbol. So, like this, we can go ahead and add a div, and we'll actually want to add this into our code just so that we can go ahead and have something to mess with once we do have our CSS injected. In previous lessons, we actually practiced a bit of CSS using inline styling, but for this project, we're going to go ahead and take the proper approach to CSS. So, before I move on, let's go ahead and add a style attribute to our element. And actually, I'm wrong, not a style attribute, but in this case, we're going to add a new attribute, and this new attribute will be ID. And ID will be equal to, let's say, sandbox. So in reviewing our HTML, we can actually go ahead and look and see a bit of a parallel with our CSS in terms of what structure we're going to be using to define or use CSS. In our previous lessons, we used inline styling through a style attribute inside of our HTML tag or element that allowed for us to change attributes such as color or background color of our elements. With CSS, what we're doing is essentially creating a file that will control the style of almost every block or every block that you select inside of the HTML page, and in doing so, override it with a style attribute that is a lot more organized. So let's go ahead and start with the first rule of CSS. To begin, we're actually going to go ahead and call this new attribute that we added to our div. Now, ID, it's not actually short for anything. Well, I guess it's short for identification, but just in the same way that we use IDs to identify ourselves in any scenario for school or for getting into somewhere in an event, you have an ID to identify yourself. So in this case, we're going to call our ID, and to do so, we'll enter in a hashtag and follow it with the same name we have entered into the attribute. So hashtag sandbox, box, and this is followed by a curly bracket. Now, you'll find the curly bracket usually right next to your P key, and you'll have to hold Shift in order to get it to work. But this is the syntax, or the way that CSS contains its rules. Previously, with the elements, with the element attribute for the inline styling, we found that we had to type everything inside of these quotation marks. These curly brackets will replace that in this case. And now we'll go ahead and add a property like we had previously. And in this case, I'll go ahead and add a background color of red. Let's see if our block appears. Well, it doesn't take up any space yet, so it won't just happen. But before we continue, let's go ahead and look at this syntax structure. So with this syntax, what we're looking at is essentially what comes out to us calling or telling the file where to apply its rules, followed by its container. These curly brackets will contain the rules for what we want to apply. And now the actual part that matters, the property and the property value. Now, just reading this like a sentence, we can probably assume the property is going to be our background color, and we end our property with the colon. The colon will tell the code, well, let's go ahead and listen to what's next. And usually what follows, and really the only thing that should follow, will be the property of that property, actually. So we have our property and our property value. So whatever this value is worth or is equal to is what will be spit out. So we don't see anything just yet, but we can correct that by adding another property, and in this case I'll follow with width, and I'll make it 300 pixels wide, and I'll add a height of 400 pixels, and like that we have our blue box. So for one final time, let's go ahead and review this structure. We have our property followed by a colon, followed by our property value, followed by a semicolon, and continue forever until we have a completed web page. But let's talk about practical application. When it comes to actually using CSS, in some cases, using it won't be as easy as it is in CodePen. Usually, we'll have to link the CSS manually, and this will involve linking it in the head. So let's go ahead and review what a real use case would look like when actually applying CSS. Before getting into the specifics of linking the file, let's go ahead and discuss the subject of the ID and how we called that, and its brother or very close relative that you'll actually end up using a lot more. In the case of an ID, we use it for something that is an individual. We give people in the real world IDs because everyone is different and is given that unalienable right. We are individuals. But if you're part of a class, kind of like being in a classroom, if you're part of Mr. Murphy's class or you're part of Mrs. Rodriguez's class, you're part of a class. And it literally applies the same way when we're talking about classes in CSS. So if I wanted to change sandbox from an ID to a class, all I would have to do is go ahead and replace that hashtag with a period and change this ID to a class. So now, instead of only having one sandbox, we can go ahead and have multiple. But why can't we use divs or IDs in the same way? And technically you can, but it isn't good practice, because sometime in the future, when you have to find something that is an individual or by itself, and you end up changing everything on the page, it suddenly becomes a massive fire that you have to deal with. So, classes, IDs. We'll explore these throughout the CSS series. However, for now, just think in your head about that class to ID contrast. Now, without digging too much deeper, I think we'll wrap things up for today here. And let's go ahead and actually talk about remembering all these languages. When it comes to the full stack of web development, you'll find that you'll have to learn 4 or 5. You can get away with 3, you can get away with 2. But there's multiple languages that you'll most likely need to know in the world of web development. And usually they're really similar to each other. They just are flavors in the same way that you have flavors of ice cream. Mocha might be really close to coffee ice cream, but they're kind of different things. And you'll find the same thing in the programming world, where you'll have different flavors of maybe the same language. But in terms of remembering them or keeping them separate so that you don't accidentally end up writing one language inside of another file, just go ahead and practice each language individually. Eventually, you'll get to a point where you're confident enough to have the syntax completely down. And at the end of the day, it's all about practice. Just keep going through with it, and eventually it will get burned into your head. Hopefully this was a good introduction into CSS and will help you with adjusting your web pages or restyling them to look a lot more to your liking. In the future of the series, we'll touch more on specific values that we can change and how we can really refine our websites. But until then, we'll see you next time.